Hello, welcome to the last of the 4-lecture series on American religious liberty, specifically how the Supreme Court viewed the religion clauses of the First Amendment.
Don't worry about your mic.
Okay. All right, so first a brief recap. The first 3 lectures dealt with the Free Exercise Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And of course, after the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments were added to the Constitution, determined to enforce federal civil rights on the states so that they could not do mistreatment of the former slaves. But then, of course, politically, Democrats got into office from the South and over time managed to put through Jim Crow laws and get Supreme Court justices appointed who took the teeth out of that and even said that the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment, that no state shall abridge or infringe the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States, didn't mean the Bill of Rights. And then they passed Plessy v. Ferguson, segregating schools, and so on. Well, you may recall that by the 1960s, the Supreme Court had recognized the Free Exercise Clause applied to the states through the 14th Amendment and set a standard called the Sherbert test, by which a law burdening free exercise of religion would have to pass in order to remain valid. So if you burden the free exercise of religion, that's the first part of the test. That means that the law is now subject to that test. If it didn't burden the free exercise of religion, the Sherbert test doesn't apply and you're dealing with something other than free exercise. But if it did, then the state, by which we mean any government agency or official, had to prove that the law in question was meeting a compelling state interest. And if it met a compelling state interest, it goes on to the final prong of the test. If not, then the law is struck down, because if it's not meeting a compelling state interest, how can you dare burden the free exercise of religion, a fundamental constitutional right? However, if it meets a compelling interest, for example, public safety during COVID, when churches were ordered to space their seating out and for everyone to wear masks, and a church refused to do that in Southern California and was rightfully prosecuted for it. They said, no, our freedom religion says we don't have to do this. I said, it's basic public safety. It's like you saying you don't need to have fire exits because the Bible says so. Sorry. So the state has to prove that not exempting someone who's religiously burdened from that generally applicable, facially neutral law is the least restrictive means of meeting that compelling state interest. If exempting someone for religious reasons from that law doesn't make the point of the law fall apart, if making exceptions doesn't destroy the whole thing, then the law stands, but it doesn't apply to those burdened in their free exercise of religion. In the case of the original case, Sherbert, the Supreme Court ruled that because she had been fired from her job for refusing to work on her Sabbath, and then refused new work if they were going to make her work on her Sabbath, that she was entitled to unemployment benefits because she had been fired for exercising her religion. Then in the 1990s, the Smith decision, Employment Division v. Smith, dumped everything upside down when the Supreme Court majority acted as though the Sherbert test had never been enforced, saying it was only used for analytical purposes, but it wasn't actually used to reach any of their decisions for the previous roughly 30 years. And they said, any generally applicable, facially neutral law stands as opposed to one that clearly singles out religion or identifies a religion or religious adherence or a religious practice to infringe. To back that up, when Congress freaked out, the public freaked out, and Congress put forth a bill called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993, the Supreme Court took the case of the Church of the Lukumi Babaluai, in which Santeria adherents were being told they couldn't build a temple in Hialeah, Florida, and observe their religion there because animal sacrifice was forbidden, unless it was for medical reasons, like medical research, or euthanizing pets and strays, or the kosher butcher shop and slaughterhouse, and so on and so on. So they built into the law every exemption they could think of except the one that would apply to that church, and then said, and anything that's not specifically exempted is now illegal. And the Supreme Court said, no, you're not getting out of it that easy. We know from the board, the city board meetings, and other testimony and transcripts that you set out to ban religious animal sacrifice and to keep the Santeria Church out of the city limits. The law is struck down. You were aiming at religion. Then, in 1997, in Bernie v. Flores, the Catholic Church in Bernie was expanding because they were growing rapidly, and they wanted to add on to the back of their building. It was a historic building, protected by historic preservation law. No alterations to the general appearance of the building allowed because of historic significance. So the bishop sued, and the Supreme Court said, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act doesn't apply here because it can't apply to state-level actions. As we said in Smith, the Sherbert test does not govern. But because Congress does have the right to regulate the federal judiciary, it binds us. So the Religious Freedom Restoration Act requires all federal courts, and still does, to follow the Sherbert test, strict scrutiny in cases of religious free exercise. The compelling state interest, the least restrictive means, and it had to have burdened religious exercise in the first place. And if it's not the least restrictive means of meeting a compelling interest, the law is struck down, at least as it applies to those religious people. And if it doesn't even meet a compelling interest, it's struck down. But that doesn't apply to the states. Congress did not have the authority, we say, to interpret the 14th Amendment, which says Congress shall have the authority to enforce this article by appropriate legislation, to decide what appropriate legislation is. Because the Supreme Court is the be-all and end-all of all existence. They didn't quite put it that way, but that's how it works out. Now, that's where things stand now. But there is the other article in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the first lecture, it's important, they said, respecting an establishment of religion. When it was framed, the writers of the Bill of Rights intended the First Amendment to prohibit Congress from interfering with establishments of religion at the state level. Any state could have whatever religion it deemed fit and support it by taxes, and also could require people to belong to that church if they wanted to. But Congress could not interfere with that and could not establish a religion for the federal government. Right now, one particular justice is actually insisting that since that is the original meaning of the Establishment Clause, it should still govern today, and any state that wants to establish its own religion should be allowed to without congressional or federal judiciary interference. But that's only one judge, one named Clarence Thomas. Since the 1940s, the Supreme Court has held that the Establishment Clause is incorporated into the 14th Amendment to apply to the states. So that means that just since 1947, the Establishment Clause says no state shall have an establishment of religion either, not just Congress. In that period, the initial incorporation period, from roughly 1947 to about 1963 to 65, again, that's rough. The Supreme Court overturned prayer in public schools and Bible reading in public schools and government funding of religious schools. And there was a big pushback because the average person, well, remembering that the average person has an IQ of 100 to begin with, so that means half of everything is below average. The average person thought this meant that it was now against the law for their children to pray in public schools, or to read the Bible, or bring the Bible with them to school. Not paying attention to what isn't really the fine print, but is really the headline. Government can no longer force your child to say the prayer that either the government wrote for them to say, or that the teacher chose to make them say, if just prayer was required and not a specific one, so that left it up to the teacher's discretion, and could not be forced to listen to Bible readings in the public school, which were, invariably the King James Version, which didn't make Jews or Catholics happy at all. And that was really the point. It was protecting the free exercise of religion by not establishing a religion and forcing it on the kids. Now, more recently, as the Supreme Court has gotten more and more conservative, they try to break the wall of separation of church and state more and more, crash through it, tear it down. And so when a football coach prayed with his students, the Supreme Court did not rule, consistent with previous precedent, that by gathering his students around and saying, "Let us pray," which is a polite command, that he was using state-sponsored prayer. He said it was his personal free exercise of religion, and the children were free to volunteer in or out. That argument had been rejected in the 40s, 50s, and 60s on the basis that peer pressure and the presence of an authority figure guiding you was something that children are too impressionable to resist reasonably. So most or all of them would join in even if they didn't really want to or wouldn't have on their own independently. And now charter schools have come up, as well as vouchers for private schools, which divert state funding for public schools to the parents directly for them to spend on private school tuition, which is almost always so-called Christian day schools. These were founded in the 70s and the 60s during the civil rights movement. Of course, I don't mean there aren't still new ones being founded, but the movement began for Christian schooling, what are segregation academies, where by pulling their kids out of the public school and putting them into a private school that was teaching Christian values, they got no worry about the Bible reading or about the prayer, and they were almost all white. So they didn't have to worry about their kids being segregated. That was the animus behind that. Anyway, vouchers are getting approved all over the place, and the Supreme Court keeps approving the different voucher experiments. So they are pretty much approving taking public money from public schools away and giving it to Christian schools and other private academies. However, mediating it through the parent is what gives them their supposed imprimatur. The fact that it's being given to parents of any religion or no religion to spend as they see fit on their children's education means that it's supposedly not establishing religion. This past week, the Supreme Court had an unusual situation where one of the justices recused herself from a case, Amy Barrett Comey, because one of her closest friends, who's worked her entire career to get to the point where Oklahoma could establish religious schools paid for by state tax money, was involved in a case. And she was probably counting on her best bud to help her in this case, that this would give her victory. Well, she rightfully recused herself, and that left 8 justices. 3 justices, it wasn't a signed opinion, so we don't know how it broke down, but we can reasonably guess that the 3 justices out of the 4 that voted against this Catholic charter school paid for with public education money were the liberals or progressives, and the other 4 were conservatives. So the likeliest swing vote was the Chief Justice, John Roberts. And as a result, they were tied 4-4, which does not set a precedent because there's no majority decision. So it's not binding anywhere in the country except Oklahoma. But in Oklahoma, it let stand the Oklahoma Supreme Court's decision, which was, obviously, this is a violation of the separation of church and state. You can't use money to establish a Catholic church school. So that's where we stand right now, because she recused herself over a very specific situation. She just destroyed the lifelong dreams of one of her best friends by not siding with her in this case, because they were such good friends for so many years. I think they went to law school together. In any case, that again means it's not a precedent binding anywhere else. So in any other state, if they try and pull the same thing, and somebody will create a test case to do it on purpose for that very reason, and it comes back to the court, then it will be 5-4, or the Chief Justice will just throw his hands up and say, okay, 6-3, allowing states to establish tax-supported religious schools, because that justice was in favor of that. She was on the side of her friend. So if her friend, who's specifically practicing in Oklahoma, is not involved in a future case, she doesn't have to recuse herself, and she'll join what will then become a majority and rule that. So where we stand now is the Establishment Clause is very weakened. And justices like Clarence Thomas and lower judges that agree with him feel that the original meaning of the First Amendment should apply and that only Congress should be restricted, not the states. Others admit and recognize that the purpose of the 14th Amendment was to incorporate the Bill of Rights against the states, with the federal government enforcing that to prevent states from interfering with civil rights and civil liberties. But they will still want to weaken the separation of church and state because they believe that not letting the majority exercise their religion by dominating over others is infringing their religious exercise. What those people fail to realize is once you incorporate the Establishment Clause into the 14th Amendment and apply it to states, you have now determined that both clauses in religion of the First Amendment serve the same purpose: free exercise. The purpose of the Free Exercise Clause is no direct action to interfere with or command someone's religious beliefs. Whether they believe anything they want, they choose to believe nothing at all, no government interference, unless it's in the course of normal government business, and then they need to see if an exemption is available, possible, workable. But the Establishment Clause says that the government cannot make anyone pay taxes to support someone else's religion or anyone else's religion. So if the government can't enforce religion on anybody, or pick a particular religion, or favor a particular religion, and if the Establishment Clause says you cannot use tax money to support a religion, or enforce a religion, or pick a religion, so they can't use your tax dollars to found a Christian academy, a Jewish academy, a Muslim academy, any religious school, or your tax money to put up religious displays at Christmas or Easter or other private religious holidays on public property. It's just a matter of a larger ball of religious liberty. It's an expansion of religious freedom. So where we stand right now is a Supreme Court where only a 3-justice minority stands for that. And we could say that the Supreme Court is not likely to make a wholesale jump way in the other direction, but they've done that a lot in the last few years on other issues, where they say, no, this is settled law until we have enough votes. But they don't say that part until they actually have the votes. Any questions? Well, and that completes the 4-lecture series. We had 3 1/3 lectures on the Free Exercise Clause and a 2/3 of a lecture on the Establishment Clause, showing how they fit together. Thank you.